Hi guys, welcome back to our channel. This is the second day of our 100 Days Reddit horror series, delving into the creepiest stories from Reddit. Daily, join us on this thrilling journey. Hit that like button and subscribe for uninterrupted horror. Don't forget to share your thoughts. Matey and the Ghost. When I moved in with Grandma about 5 years ago, I didn't know what to expect. Grandma had been living alone since Grandpa died earlier that year, and when they diagnosed her with dementia when I was a senior in high school, it seemed like a bad omen. Though they had caught it early, the doctors had suggested that living alone would probably only help her condition deteriorate faster. Dementia patients often see their condition slow when they have company. Your mother has lived alone since your father died, and if someone were able to live with her, I think the ability to have someone to talk to would help her immensely. Mom and Dad had looked at each other, not sure what to do about the situation, but seemed to come to a decision pretty quickly. With me looking at college and them unable to afford housing in the dorms, they offered me a compromise. Live with my grandma and attend college nearby, or spend some time trying to get scholarships and grants to pay for my own housing. Grandma and I had always been close, and she was delighted to let me stay with her while I attended college. There was no worry that I would sneak boys in or throw parties. I wasn't really someone who did that sort of thing, and they knew that I would be home most evenings studying or resting for the coming day. I moved in at the beginning of the academic year, and that meant I was there for Halloween. Grandma and I had been living pretty harmoniously, only butting heads a few times when I came home late from classes. Grandma liked to be in bed by 9, and she didn't like to be woken up when I came in late. Grandma liked to spend most of her time in bed, watching TV and knitting, but I still came in when I had the chance to talk with her and visit. Some days she knew who I was, some days she thought I was my mom, but she was never hostile or confused with me. If she called me by my mom's name, I was Claire, and if she called me by my name, then I was Julia. Either way, we talked about our day and about life in general. I learned a lot of family secrets that way, things that she was surprised I didn't remember, and I was glad for this time with her while she was still lucid. So when I came in to find her putting candy in a bowl, I was shocked she was out of bed. She was huffing and puffing, clearly exhausted, and I wondered when she'd had time to buy the candy. She didn't drive, didn't have a car, and I didn't remember buying it. She looked up happily, holding the bowl out to me in greeting. "Claire, there you are. I wanted to hand candy out to the kids, but I feel so weak. I must be coming down with something, but I can't disappoint the kiddos." Grandma seemed to forget that she was pushing 65 and not in what anyone would call good health. When she did too much and ran out of energy, she always said she must be coming down with something, and took herself off to bed to rest, and it seemed to be her mind's way of explaining it. Somehow, it seemed I had forgotten it was Halloween, but Grandma hadn't. It wasn't that surprising. If there was one thing you could count on Grandma to remember, it was Halloween. Grandma had always been in love with Halloween, at least according to Mom. She'd insisted I decorate earlier in the month, had made us get a pumpkin from the store, which I then carved and set on the stoop, and if she had been in better health, she would have likely been in costume handing out candy. As it stood, she was lucky to have made it from her room to the table, and I knew it. I took the bowl and told her not to worry, and that I would make sure the kids got their candy. She thanked me and went to lie down, her energy spent. I went to the porch to put out the bowl of candy. I put a note on the stool so the kids knew it was a 2-piece limit, and came back in to study. Today might be sugar palooza for the little goblins out in the street, but for me, tomorrow was chem midterm and I needed to study. I was doing well, but this was only freshman year. I had big dreams, and they would be harder to fulfill with poor marks in chemistry. I heard the kids shrieking and giggling as they came up the road, heard their footsteps on the porch, heard the step pause in speculation as they read the sign, and then heard them retreat after they took their candy. Grandma lived in a fairly nice area, and the kiddos seemed used to the 2-piece rule. I'm sure some of them took a handful and ran, but they seemed to be in the minority if they did. It was dark out, probably pushing 9, when I heard a knock on the door. I looked up from my book, peering at the door as I saw the outline of a little kid in a ghost costume. He was standing there patiently, bag in hand, and I wondered how he had missed the bowl and the sign. Maybe he was looking for an authentic experience, or maybe he was special needs. Either way, I got up and walked over to the door to see what he wanted. I opened the door to find a kid in an honest-to-God bedsheet ghost costume. He looked right out of a Charlie Brown special, and the shoes poking out from the bottom looked like loafers. He held a grubby pillowcase in one hand and a candy apple in the other, and when he looked up at me through the holes in his sheet, I almost laughed. He looked like a caricature, like a memory of a Halloween long ago, and I wasn't sure he would speak for a moment. When he did, I wished he hadn't. His voice was raspy, unused, and it sucked all the joy out of me. "Is Matey here?" he asked, and I shook my head as I tried to get my own voice to work. "Nah, sorry kiddo, there's no Matey here." He nodded, and then turned and left with slow, somber steps. I thought it was odd. He hadn't even taken any candy. And when I closed the door and went back to my work, I was filled with a strange and unexplainable sense of dread. I had forgotten about it by the time Halloween rolled around again, but the little ghost hadn't forgotten about us. October 31st found me once again sitting at the table and studying for a midterm. I was still working on my prerequisites for biochem, and if everything went as planned, I'd be starting the course next year. Grandma was much the same, maybe a little more tired and a little more forgetful, but we still spent a lot of evenings chatting and watching TV. Sometimes she braided my hair, and sometimes she showed me how to knit, but we always spent at least an hour together every evening. Tonight she had turned in early, saying she was really tired and wanted to get some rest before this cold caught up to her. I had sat the candy bowl on the front porch, careful to add the usual note, and when someone knocked on the door at 8:30, I looked up to see the same little silhouette I had seen the year before. I got up, telling myself it couldn't be the same kid, but when I opened the door, there he was. The same bedsheet ghost costume, the same faux leather loafers, the same bulge around the eyes to indicate glasses, the same slightly dirty pillowcase. It was him, just as he had been the year before, and I almost prayed he would remember before speaking. "Is Matey here?" he asked in the same croaking voice, and I tried not to shudder as I smiled down at him. "Sorry, kiddo. Wrong house." He nodded solemnly, turning around and slowly walking back up the front walk as he made his way back to the street. I watched him go, not quite sure what to make of this strange little ghost boy or his apparent lack of growth. The kid looked like he might be about 5 or 6, though his voice sounded like he might be 5 or 6 years in his grave. I briefly considered that he might be a real ghost, but I put that out of my mind. It was the time of year, nothing more. I went back to studying, finishing out the evening by visiting with Grandma when she got up from her nap unexpectedly. We drank cocoa and watched a scary movie, and I fell asleep beside her in the bed she had once shared with Grandpa. The next year saw the return of the little ghost boy, and he was unchanging. I tried to ask him why he kept coming back after being told she wasn't here for 2 years running. I wanted to ask him why he thought she was here, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him anything. There was a barrier between us that went deeper than a misunderstanding, and it was like we were standing on opposite sides of a gulf and shouting at each other over the tide. He left when I didn't say anything, nodding and turning like he always did before disappearing into the crowd. I didn't see him the year after that, but to be fair, I was a little preoccupied. That was my 4th year in college, and I was only a year from graduating and moving on to work in the field of biochemistry. I had been heading home when a colleague of mine invited me to a little department party. I was helping my teacher as a TA, and the other TAs were having a little get-together in honor of the season. I started to decline, but I thought it might be fun. I had never really allowed myself to get into the college scene, never really partied or hung out with friends, and all that focus takes a toll sometimes. I hadn't really been to a social gathering since high school, and I was curious to see what it was like. I'll admit, I indulged a little more than I should have. But when I came home and found my grandmother lying by the front door, it sobered me up pretty quickly. Her doctor said that she had fallen when she tried to get to the door, and I couldn't help but wonder if she had been going to answer the knocking of a certain little ghost boy. They kept her in the hospital for nearly 3 months, monitoring her and making sure she hadn't given herself brain damage or something. Her condition progressed while she was in the hospital, and after a time she either only recognized me as my mother or didn't recognize me at all. She began asking for Albie, always looking for Albie, but I didn't know who that was. Mom was puzzled too, wondering if maybe she was talking about her dad, whose name had been Albert. I've never heard her call him Albie, but I suppose it could be a nickname. They knew each other as children, so it's entirely possible. After a while, they sent her home, but the prognosis was not good. They gave her less than a year to live, saying she would need round-the-clock care from now on. I didn't need to be asked this time. I felt guilty for not being there, and I knew that I had to be there for her now. I took a leave of absence from school, putting my plans on hold so I could take care of my grandma. I continued to take some courses online, hoping to not get too far behind, but I devoted most of my time to her. She was mostly unresponsive, whispering sometimes as she called out for Albie or her mother and father, great-grandparents I had never met. She talked to Albie about secret places and hidden treasures, and her voice was that of a little girl now. She had regressed even more, and every day that I woke up to find her breathing was a blessing. Grandma proved them wrong, and when Halloween came around again, I was in for a surprise. I had taken to sleeping on a cot at the foot of her bed, keeping an ear out for any sounds of trouble, but a loud clatter from the kitchen had me rolling to my feet and looking around in confusion. I looked at the bed and saw she was still in it, so the sound couldn't have been her. As another loud bang sounded in that direction, I was off and moving before I could think better of it. I was afraid that an animal had gotten into the house. No burglar would have made that much noise, and when I came into the kitchen I saw, just for a second, the furry black backside of some cat or dog or maybe a small bear. As it climbed out of the cabinet it had been rooting through, I saw it was a person, though it was certainly a grubby one. It was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, and she looked filthy. She was wearing a threadbare black dress with curly-toed shoes and a pointed hat that she scooped off the floor. The longer I watched her, the more I came to understand that she wasn't really dirty, but had covered herself lightly in stove ash for some reason. She didn't seem to have noticed me. She was digging through cupboards and drawers as she searched for whatever it was she was after, leaving destruction in her wake. "Hey!" I called out after some of my surprise had faded. "What are you doing?" The girl turned and looked confused as she took me in. "What are you doing here? This is my house. You better leave before my mama sees you and gets mad." She continued to look through things, working her way into the living room, and I followed behind her, not sure what to say. Was this a dream? If it was a pretty vivid one. I could feel the carpet beneath my feet, hear the leaky faucet in the kitchen, smell the lunch I had cooked a few hours before. The little girl had wrecked half the living room before I shook off my discomfort and asked her what she was looking for. If this was a dream, then I supposed I had to play along. "I need my pillowcase, the one with the pumpkin on it. It's my special Halloween bag, and I can't go trick-or-treating without it." I opened my mouth to ask where she'd left it, but I stopped suddenly as something occurred to me. I had seen that pillowcase before. It had been in Grandma's closet for ages, and when I had offered to wash it for her, she had shaken her head and said it had too many memories. There was a pumpkin drawn on one side in charcoal, a black cat on the other side, and a witch's hat between them. Someone had sewn strings around the top so it could be pulled shut, and it looked like a grubby peddler's sack. Surely if this was a dream, then Grandma wouldn't mind if I gave this child the bag. Maybe that's why she had been keeping it, just in case this kid came looking for it. I told the girl to wait for a minute and that I would get it for her. Okay, but hurry. Halloween won't last all night. It took a little looking, but I finally found it under some old quilts at the top of the closet. At some point, Grandma must have recolored the cat and hat, and I wondered when she'd had the energy. She hadn't even been out of bed without me by her side in over a year, so she must have done this before her fall. I took the bag out to the living room and held it out to the girl who was leaning against the sofa. Her eyes lit up and she snatched it happily as she danced around and thanked me. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," she trumpeted. "Now I can go trick-or-treating." As soon as, and as if on cue, a knock came from the door. The little witch ran to answer it, and I was unsurprised to see the little ghost boy waiting for her. "Maybe," he said happily, and she wrapped him in a hug like she hadn't seen him in years. "Albie," she trumpeted in return. "Ready to go?" "For ages, Slowpoke," he said, the smile beneath the sheet coming out in his words. The two left the porch hand in hand, disappearing out into the crowd as they went to go trick-or-treating. I watched them go, feeling a mixture of warmth and completion, and that was when I remembered my grandma. I had left her alone for a long while, and when I went to check on her, I found her too still in her bed. I started to begin CPR, but after putting a couple of fingers to her throat, I knew it was too late. She was cold. She had likely been dead before I was awoken by the clatter in the kitchen, and I held back tears as I called the ambulance and let my parents know that she had passed. The funeral was quick. Grandma was laid to rest next to Grandpa, and a week later I was helping Mom clean out Grandma's house. It was my house now. Grandma had left it to me in her will, and Mom was packing up some mementos and deciding what to donate. We were going through her closet when I found a box with keepsakes in it. There were pictures of my mom when she was little, wedding photos of Grandma and Grandpa, and some letters Grandpa had written her during Vietnam. Mom came over as I was going through them, smiling at the pictures and crying a little over the letters, but I felt my breath stick in my throat as I came to a very old photo at the bottom of the box. It was a small photo of two kids in costumes on the front porch of a much different house. One was a ghost, his eye holes bulging with glasses, and the other was a witch who had clearly rubbed wood ash on her face. "Julia?" Mom asked, the picture shaking in my hand. "Honey, are you okay?" The picture fell back into the box, and there on the back was the last piece of the puzzle. Madeline and Albert, Halloween 1960. That was the last I saw of the little witch or the ghost, but when Halloween comes to call, the two are never very far from my mind. I always hand out candy and decorate the house, just as Grandma would have wanted. You never quite know what sort of ghosts and goblins might come to visit. I shouldn't have robbed the house. I was inside the master bedroom when I heard the garage open and a car go in. I looked at my friend Victor as we realized the couple came home early. We hadn't expected that. "Put everything back," Victor whispered to me. We took all the watches, tablets, money, and anything we took back exactly as we found them. I heard the couple speaking downstairs but couldn't make out anything. After we put everything back, Victor told me to follow him. He pulled down the scuttle attic, trying to do as little noise as he could. When we got up, he closed it and we were inside the attic. It had a few small windows that brought in sunlight, and the attic was empty except for a few boxes. We stood there for a minute waiting to see if we would hear them. We didn't really hear anything, but we didn't hear them leave either. The attic was hot, and it didn't help we were wearing warm clothes, gloves, and baseball caps. "Let's try to leave," Victor whispered. We got down the attic and tiptoed away. Victor opened the door quietly and quickly shut it quietly. "The man is here," Victor said. I asked, "What is he doing?" And Victor said, "He's going into the child's room." When I first entered the kids' room a few minutes before the couple arrived, I was shocked. Through spying on them for the past week, to know their routine, I never saw their daughter. At least I assume the child is a daughter based off the decoration of the room. Did you see their kid at all? I asked. Victor shook his head. Maybe she's in a boarding school or camp or something. Victor made a guess. We heard the man walk downstairs and we heard a female, his wife I assume. Everything is ready. We heard 2 pairs off footsteps walk into the basement. Me and Victor assumed everything was fine and tiptoed downstairs. Victor tried to open the door, but it was locked. When we tried to find another exit, we heard a saw down the basement and a violent scream. It sounded like a man was getting cut. Me and Victor froze. The screaming didn't stop. The muffled screaming kept going. Me and Victor walked to a window to open it. When I tried to open it, I couldn't. Victor whispered, "Leave it to me." When he tried, he couldn't either. We noticed a small iron mechanism on the window, a window latch. We went from one window to another as the screaming continued. Suddenly Victor accidentally hit a small table. It lifted a little before crashing down, making a large thud. The saw stopped. We froze in place, but then we heard 2 pairs of footsteps coming upstairs. Victor told me to follow him and I did. We got to the kitchen and hid inside the pantry. We heard the basement door open. The man said, "Is someone here? I'll call the police." I didn't know whether or not he'll do it considering what we heard in the basement. Suddenly the woman's voice said, "Did more of them follow us?" A worry in her voice. The man said, "No one's coming. Let's check around." There me and Victor were hiding again. We didn't plan on hurting anyone. Just a few items stolen, but now violence might be unavoidable. After a few minutes, Victor opened the pantry door. Me and him peeked outside and saw the wife. Her hands covered in blood and she was washing them. Me and Victor got worried. We were in a house with serial killers. Suddenly a guy with a tank top and underwear only came into the room. He was covered in blood and missing his hands. When the woman noticed him, she screamed. The man, completely oblivious, asked her for help. She took out a big kitchen knife and started stabbing him repeatedly until died. The husband ran into the room. He comforted her and she asked, "How'd he escape?" The man said, "I don't know. I'll check if the other escaped." As he left, me and Victor knew we had to escape. Who knows what they'd do if they caught us. Victor took a large can of beans and told me to follow his lead. We went outside the pantry and went next to the woman. When she noticed us, she was about to scream when Victor hit her in the head. Her skin split open. A few seconds later, she was about to scream again when Victor hit her again and again until she died, blood covering half her face. Me and Victor ran to escape, not caring about being quiet anymore. When we got to the garage door, it was locked. "Damn it," said Victor. We ran to the dining room. Victor told me, "Break the window." I took a chair and started hitting the window. It broke and I thought it was all over until I heard the man's footsteps running up the basement. Victor whispered, "I'll get him, just stay there." As he hid behind the door, the man came with a machete. He lunged at me, but Victor reacted quickly and hit him in the back of his head. He fell on the broken pieces of glass in the window. When he pulled himself up, he collapsed almost instantly. He was dead. Victor said, "Let's go and get the guy downstairs." And I nodded. We ran down in the basement and saw sheeted hospital curtains and hospital beds. On one of them had lots of blood and butyl restraints. I guess the man earlier managed to squeeze through. We saw 2 large dog cages. One was empty while the other had the other man. He had long strained hair and an average body build. He had his mouth covered in silver duct tape and his hands were also taped together. He looked at us with fearful, pleading eyes. "We're here to rescue you," I said. I noticed the lock on the cage. The man pointed at his pocket and upstairs. Victor ran upstairs and came down with the keys. Apparently they were in the husband's pocket. When we freed him and cut all the duct tape with scissors, Victor said, "If you call the police, we were never here, all right." The man thought for a moment he would have to take the blame for 2 kills, but it was self-defense, right? The man said, "I think it's best if I just leave." Me and Victor nodded. We went back to the upstairs and the keys could also open the front door. When we left, the man thanked us and ran while me and Victor took our car that was a couple blocks away and drove home. We turned on the news, but we knew it would be a while before anyone found them. Suddenly the newsman said, Today marks the 1-year anniversary of Luna's kidnapping. They show a picture of a young girl. Then the newsman said, "This is a video from her parents Jason and Mariah. They show the two people, the same people that owned the house we were just in and killed them. In the video the two said, 'Whoever took her, if you're seeing this, please give us our daughter. She's all we want, we'll give you anything.'" Then the newsman said, "Hey, race pictures of the two suspects. They show the guy we saw the woman kill in the kitchen and the man we just freed." The newsman said, "They're both registered sex offenders. If you see them, report to the police immediately." Victor nearly threw up. "What have we done?" I shouted. "What the hell have we done?" Student chainsaw nurses. Detective Scott zoomed in on the files he had gathered that outlined how to enter the abandoned asylum from the entrance beside the meat packing plant sign. The grounds of the old asylum still had their old wrought iron gates surrounding them majestically. It could have passed for a public park even, except part of the asylum had been sold off and turned into a meat packing plant. Detective Scott took in the grisly, industrial nature of it all. He felt awkward in his Adidas tracksuit, but he was trying to pass as a uni student and knew that would help him look the right age. Scott had answered the ad. He'd told the group of nurses he was looking for some extra cash and that he'd like to take part in their clinical trial. After a series of grueling questions, he seemed to convince them he was desperate for the cash and he really needed to sell his kidney. His research had led him to the reality. St. Verity's Asylum had become a nexus for organ trafficking. As Detective Scott approached the waiting room, he glanced in the mirror to make sure he gave off the air of looking like a poor student. He left one of his shoes unlaced for effect and signed himself in. His intel had reports of several nurses that had formed a cult, an organization with dark rituals tied to the hospital's profit from illicit organ sales. Marnie, his boss told him, "Marnie is the organizer. An informant let us know that's her name." Detective Scott listened for her. The sound of distant laughter echoed, followed by a high-pitched scream. Scott's eyes darted towards the sound. He patted his gun holster to be sure it was in its place and crept along the wall, down the hallway towards the sound, clinging tightly to his phone for its flashlight. The hallways were growing darker and dingier with each turn. Emerging into an operating room, he stopped to pause. He caught sight of strange shapes taped to the wall. Eerie dolls, their eyes glistening as they seemed to watch him, adorned the room. He was pondering if these were actually grim trophies of Marnie's cult sacrifices when he noticed a glistening chainsaw hung from the wall. Suddenly, the door swung open and in charged a nurse with a chainsaw. She was tall and slender, dressed in an outdated nurse's uniform that hugged her frame too tightly. Her eyes searched the room, but Detective Scott had successfully ducked and hid himself behind the operating tables. "You shouldn't be here, Detective," she crooned, revving up the chainsaw. The raw, brutal growl rung out. Oil and smoke flung off the chainsaw. "This place is far too dangerous for someone like you," she screamed above the buzzing. She revved the engine in whirs. Detective Scott could see her feet coming for him. She flung under the table a little further out of her reach and lay as still as he could. "Come on out, Detective Scott. Come meet Marnie. You need to be repurposed." Scott's mind raced. He jumped up and took aim at her with his gun. "You're trafficking organs," he said as he brought the gun up to his eye to take his best shot at her thigh. He only intended to sting her, to make her go down. Marnie laughed as the bullet ricocheted off her bulletproof armor. She turned the chainsaw off, almost as if she knew leisure was all hers. The people that come here, they become part of something so much larger than themselves. You see, Detective, every scream, every lost life is a celebration. And she stepped closer, her intent evident, we know just how to give the gift of life to others. Do you understand? But a sudden surge of adrenaline, Scott turned to flee. Marnie lunged as she pulled the chainsaw roaring to life. She was quick on his tail. She swung it in menacing arcs. He barely dodged, his heart pounding in rhythm with the machine's growl. He ran for his life, his instincts screaming at him to escape. The hallways of St. Verity's twisted around him, each turn revealing new horrors. A flicker of knives cutting patients open in the room's shadows, ghostly figures that seemed to be pushing carts of dead bodies down the hallway. Doors that had once held the promises of mental healing now led to rooms filled with grotesque, macabre displays of butchery. The more he searched for an exit, the more he realized there was no way out but through the meat packing plant. "Did you think you could escape?" Marnie's voice echoed. Now multiple student nurses had grabbed their chainsaws out of the operating room to chase Detective Scott, the intruder. He could smell the smoke of their chainsaws and the inhuman choir of female voices leering and screaming for his demise. He stumbled, running into the broiler room, but it felt as if shadows themselves were creeping into his mind, distorting his senses. He tripped on wiring taped to the floor. Marnie towered above him, oil spittle dripping off her hot, revving chainsaw. "Please," he gasped, pulling on her leg, desperate for her charity. "I will do anything you want. I will liberate." She twirled, the chainsaw dancing happily above her head. She kicked his head to the ground and put her shoe on his cheek. It was clear this was a joyous performance for her, set to the rhythm of terror. "I will free you from the constraints of this life." She pushed his head down, exposing the nape of his neck. He twisted, all vulnerable. "You don't want trapped in this mundane life, detective, do you? You want to soar with us, don't you?" In a flash of terror, Scott glimpsed up. A whole coven of student nurses now stood in a circle around him, revving their chainsaws in union, smiling wickedly. The truth hit Detective Scott. The dolls in the operating rooms, they weren't just gruesome decorations. They were effigies of the people that had died, transformed into relics for their indulgence. "If you put his neck that way, the vein's going to gush blood all over us all, Marnie," one of the nurses complained. A whir of chainsaws filled Detective Scott's head. The last words shattered through him as Marnie. In that instant, with fear coursing through his veins, Scott spurted all over the room. "This one needs an apple in his mouth, don't you think?" one of the student nurses asked, laughing. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated with daily horror stories. Your support helps me reach you easily. See you tomorrow. Bye.